Why phone booths vanished. There was a time when every street corner had a phone booth. People stepped inside to call home, report emergencies, or hear the voice of someone they missed. Today, most phone booths are gone, replaced by the glowing rectangles in our pockets. Their disappearance was not sudden, it was the result of changing technology, shifting economics, and new social habits that transformed the way the world communicates. The rise of phone booths. Before phones became personal devices, communication looked very different. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, telephones were rare, expensive, and usually installed only in homes, offices, or wealthy establishments. Most people had no way to make a call unless they were physically near a fixed telephone. This created a major gap in access to communication, especially in cities where people were constantly on the move. To solve this problem, public telephone systems began to appear. Early versions were simple coin-operated phones placed inside shops or train stations. But, as cities grew busier and demand increased, telephone companies needed a more organized and accessible solution. This led to the creation of the phone booth, a small, enclosed space that protected the phone from weather, noise, and vandalism while giving users privacy to make their calls. The first phone booths quickly became a practical success. They were installed on sidewalks, in transportation hubs, and in public squares. For many people, especially those traveling or living in small apartments without telephones, booths were essential. They offered a quick, reliable way to contact family, arrange meetings, or call for help in emergencies. By the mid-20th century, phone booths had become a familiar part of urban life. Brightly colored and often made of glass and metal, they stood as symbols of modern communication and technological progress. Cities around the world adopted them, and they became so common that most people could find one within a short walk. As their presence grew, phone booths were no longer just practical tools, they became cultural landmarks. They appeared in films, advertisements, and everyday street scenes, representing connection in a fast-moving world. For decades, they played a vital role in how society stayed in touch. Long before personal phones made communication portable and private, mobile phones changed everything. For decades, phone booths were an essential part of daily life. People planned around them, searched for them on street corners, and kept coins ready in case they needed to make a call. But all of that began to change with the arrival of mobile phones, a technology that quietly reshaped communication more quickly than almost anything before it. The earliest mobile phones in the 1980s were bulky, expensive, and limited in function. They were mostly used by business professionals or emergency services. At first, they didn't seem like a real threat to phone booths. However, as technology improved through the 1990s and early 2000s, mobile phones became smaller, cheaper, and more widely available. What was once a luxury item gradually turned into something ordinary people could afford. This shift changed behavior almost immediately. Instead of walking to a phone booth, people could now make a call from wherever they were on the street, at home, or while traveling. Communication became instant and personal. There was no need to search for a working booth or wait in line. A phone was now something people carried with them at all times. Text messaging added another layer of convenience. Instead of making calls, users could send short messages quietly and quickly. Later, smartphones expanded these possibilities even further, introducing internet access, video calls, and apps that replaced many traditional forms of communication altogether. The phone booth, once a vital public service, could not compete with a device that fit in your pocket and did far more than just make calls. As mobile phones became universal, the number of payphone users dropped sharply. Telephone companies began removing booths because they were no longer profitable. What was once a busy and necessary public utility slowly faded into obsolescence, replaced by a technology that transformed not just how people communicated, but where and when they could do it. Maintenance became too expensive. As phone booths became less frequently used, their upkeep started to make less and less financial sense. What had once been a profitable public service gradually turned into a costly responsibility for telephone companies and local governments. Even though booths were simple in design, keeping them functional required constant attention, labor, and money. Each phone booth needed regular maintenance to stay usable. The phone lines had to be checked for connectivity. Coin mechanisms had to be repaired or emptied, and broken handsets needed replacement. Glass panels were often damaged and required fixing, and lighting systems had to be kept working so booths could be used safely at night. In busy urban areas, this maintenance was an ongoing cycle. However, as mobile phones became more common, fewer people relied on these public telephones. With declining usage came declining revenue. Coin-operated calls once helped cover maintenance costs, but as calls decreased, so did the income needed to support the system. Telephone companies began operating at a loss when it came to public booths, forcing them to reconsider whether keeping them was worth the expense. The problem became even more noticeable in large cities, where thousands of booths had once been installed. Maintaining such a wide network required teams of technicians and regular service routes. But as demand dropped, those same resources were no longer justified. A booth that might only be used a few times a week still needed the same level of upkeep as one used daily, making the cost per call extremely high. Over time, companies began removing booths in stages. Some were decommissioned, while others were simply abandoned and left to deteriorate. As maintenance budgets tightened, the focus shifted toward more modern communication infrastructure, such as mobile networks and internet services, which served far more users at a lower long-term cost. Eventually, it became clear that phone booths were no longer economically sustainable. What had once been a widespread and necessary public utility slowly disappeared, not because it stopped working, but because it became too expensive to keep working for so few people. Vandalism and safety problems. As phone booths became less essential to everyday life, they also became less protected and less cared for. In their early years, booths were busy, well-maintained public utilities that people used frequently, but once usage began to decline, many phone booths were left unattended for long periods, making them easy targets for vandalism and misuse. One of the most common issues was physical damage. Glass panels were often cracked or completely shattered, and metal frames were scratched or bent. Payphones themselves were frequently broken, with damaged keypads, cut wires, or stolen coin boxes. In some cases, entire booths were removed or destroyed, simply because repairing them cost more than replacing them. Graffiti also became a widespread problem, because phone booths were usually placed in public areas and not closely monitored. They often became surfaces for tagging and artwork. While some graffiti could be seen as creative expression, it also contributed to a sense that many booths were neglected or unsafe. Over time, a broken or heavily marked booth signaled abandonment rather than usefulness. Beyond vandalism, safety concerns played a growing role in their disappearance. In some urban areas, poorly maintained booths became associated with suspicious or illegal activity, especially at night. Their enclosed design, once valued for privacy, sometimes made them feel isolated or unsafe when located in poorly lit or low-traffic areas. As a result, both users and city officials began viewing them as potential risks rather than helpful services. There was also a practical safety issue. Malfunctioning equipment, exposed wires, broken glass, and faulty phone components created hazards for anyone trying to use them. Without regular maintenance, these risks increased, making booths less appealing and sometimes dangerous to approach. As mobile phones became widespread, these problems were no longer worth solving. With so few people relying on phone booths, investing time and money into repairing vandalized or unsafe units no longer made sense. Gradually, removal became the preferred solution. In the end, vandalism and safety concerns accelerated the decline of phone booths. What had once been a trusted public resource slowly turned into an overlooked piece of street furniture, no longer worth protecting in a world that had moved on to safer, more personal forms of communication. The internet replaced more than calls. When phone booths first appeared, their purpose was simple: to let people make voice calls in public spaces. For much of the 20th century, that was enough. A quick phone call could connect families, arrange meetings, or handle emergencies. But the arrival of the internet and later, smartphones changed communication far beyond what phone booths were designed to support. At first, the internet seemed unrelated to phone booths. Early online systems were slow, limited, and mostly used on desktop computers. However, as broadband connections spread and mobile technology advanced, the internet became a central part of everyday life. Communication was no longer just about speaking, it expanded into messaging, sharing, searching, and interacting in real time. Email replaced many routine phone calls, allowing people to send detailed messages without needing to speak directly. Instant messaging apps made communication even faster, turning conversations into continuous text exchanges. Social media platforms added another layer, allowing users to communicate with large groups of people at once. Compared to these tools, stepping into a phone booth to make a single voice call felt increasingly outdated. Smartphones combined all of these functions into one device. A single pocket-sized phone could now make calls, send texts, browse the internet, navigate maps, take photos, and stream video. This level of convenience made phone booths unnecessary for nearly every situation. Even when someone needed to make a call, they could do it instantly without searching for a public booth or carrying coins. The internet also changed expectations about communication itself. People began to expect constant connectivity and immediate responses. Communication was no longer tied to a specific location or device. It became something continuous and portable. Phone booths, by contrast, were fixed in place and limited to one function. That limitation made them less relevant in a rapidly evolving digital world. As online communication tools improved, public payphones saw even less use. The combination of mobile internet access, messaging apps, and video calling eliminated nearly every reason to rely on them. What once served as a vital public service was replaced by a network of digital communication tools that required no physical infrastructure in the same way. In the end, the internet didn't just replace phone booths, it redefined communication itself. It shifted human interaction from public, location-based devices to personal, always available networks. Phone booths could not keep up with that transformation, and they quietly faded into history. The legacy of phone booths. Even though phone booths have mostly disappeared from streets around the world, their impact is still visible in how people remember and represent them. For decades, they were an ordinary part of daily life, quietly supporting communication in cities, towns, and remote areas. Today, they remain powerful symbols of a time when staying connected required effort, planning, and physical presence. Phone booths were more than just utility structures. They represented accessibility in public spaces, giving anyone regardless of income or ownership of a private phone the ability to reach out when needed. In emergencies, they were often lifelines. For travelers or people away from home, they were a simple way to check in with loved ones. Their presence made communication feel shared and public in a way that modern devices rarely do. Culturally, phone booths became iconic. They appeared in films, television shows, and literature as recognizable symbols of city life. In some stories, they were even used as dramatic settings, places where important conversations happened, or where characters experienced turning points. Over time, the image of a phone booth became nostalgic, representing a slower and more physical era of communication. As many booths were removed, communities began finding creative ways to preserve them. Some were converted into miniature libraries, where people could leave and take books. Others were transformed into art installations, Wi-Fi stations, or charging points for mobile devices. These repurposed booths serve as reminders of how public infrastructure can be adapted even after its original purpose fades. The legacy of phone booths also lives on in design and culture. The idea of stepping into a small, private space to connect with someone remotely still influences how people think about communication. Even modern video calls and phone conversations carry echoes of that enclosed, focused experience. Ultimately, phone booths tell a story of transition. They mark the shift from public, shared communication tools to personal, always available digital devices. While they no longer serve their original function, they remain part of the collective memory of how people once connected with each other. Their legacy is not just about technology, but about change, how quickly human habits can evolve. and how even the most familiar objects can become symbols of a past era. In Japan, public phone booths are still relatively common, especially in train stations, airports, and busy urban areas. They are often transparent green or gray, and many remain operational, partly because Japan maintains strong disaster preparedness systems that include access to public communication during emergencies. In Germany, the classic bright yellow Telefonzellen can still be found in some locations. While most have been removed, a number have been repurposed into book exchange booths, where people can leave and borrow books freely. In France, traditional phone booths have largely disappeared, but some blue cabins téléphoniques still exist in rural areas or protected historic sites. In cities like Paris, many have been removed or transformed into advertising spaces or small public installations. In the United States, phone booths are now extremely rare. A few remain as nostalgic or decorative installations, particularly in places like New York City or preserved historic districts, but most were removed in the early 2000s. As mobile phones became widespread, in Switzerland and parts of Italy, some booths still exist in mountain towns and older neighborhoods, primarily as emergency backups rather than everyday tools. Overall, these examples show that while the decline of phone booths is a global trend, each country has adapted them in different ways ranging from full removal to partial preservation and creative reuse. The United Kingdom stands out as the most culturally visible exception. In the United Kingdom, however, phone booths never completely disappeared from public imagination. The iconic red telephone boxes remain a familiar sight in cities like London and across the countryside. Designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, these booths became cultural symbols as much as communication tools. While many were removed or decommissioned by BT Group, thousands were preserved due to their historical and aesthetic value. Today, they have taken on new lives as miniature libraries, art installations, Wi-Fi hotspots, and tourist attractions. For visitors, they are now less about making calls and more about experiencing a piece of British history alongside souvenirs and memorabilia that celebrate their instantly recognizable design. Examples of this preservation can be seen in popular souvenirs inspired by the red phone box, including miniature models, snow globes, keychains, magnets, tea towels, and postcards. In tourist shops, especially in London, they are often recreated as pencil holders, coin banks, and USB chargers styled after the original design. Their cultural recognition has also been reinforced through films and literature, including stories such as Harry Potter, where a red phone booth appears as a hidden entrance to the Ministry of Magic. Phone booths disappeared not because they failed, but because the world around them changed faster than they could adapt. What once solved a major problem, providing public access to communication, was eventually replaced by mobile phones and the internet, which offered faster, cheaper, and more flexible ways to stay connected. As technology advanced, phone booths became less necessary, then too costly to maintain, and finally impractical to keep. Declining use, vandalism, and safety concerns only accelerated their removal. Step by step, a system built for a pre-digital world was phased out by a society that no longer relied on it. Even so, phone booths are not forgotten. They remain familiar symbols in culture and memory, evoking a time when making a call meant stepping into a small glass enclosure on a street corner. Their story reflects a broader truth about technology. When better tools arrive, even the most familiar parts of everyday life can quietly fade into history.